Dr. Jess Flynn has been practicing sports medicine in the Boston area for about 15 years now. And she and I met on the sidelines there, basically after she leaned into football, feeling like the analysis surrounding injuries just really could use some improvement. And as a result, she's done some work for NBC Sports Boston. She's worked for the Boston Sports Journal. And we're happy to have her here with us, to talk about some of the specific injuries related to prospects in this year's draft. And then kind of beyond that, just how medical is different this year because of this, COVID world that we've been living in. So Jess, I'll hand it over to you.
Today, I just sort of wanted to, address, we're going to go through a few athletes with pretty big red flag injuries and how it might affect their draft stock. But I think, the elephant in the room we just have to address is that the NFL draft is all about risk reward. It's just an exercise. It's got high stakes. And obviously, in a league like the NFL, injury risk is really significant when you're looking at drafting a guy. So very briefly, I think it's important to notice sort of what the differences are this year, because I do think it's going to affect how teams are able to evaluate players. So typically all prospects go in February to the scouting combine before they can even take the field. They have a really intensive internal medicine exam where their heart, lungs, all that stuff is checked. But then the most important part, in my opinion, is actually they have their orthopedic exam. And that's where every team gets to kind of go through the athlete's injury history, surgery history. They look at old imaging, they order and receive new imaging. And probably the most important part of that is actually laying hands on the athlete, actually checking the joint that's the problem, talking to the athlete and sort of hearing about their recovery. I think that's where the most information is gleaned. The internal medicine exam grade plus the orthopedic grade come together and they make the athlete's medical grade. And then 2 weeks prior to the draft, about 50 athletes every year are brought back for reevaluation. And that could be because they just had a recent surgery and teams want to get a look at them right before they make their decisions, or maybe something was picked up at the combine and they just want to recheck that. The important difference is this year is obviously there is no scouting combine. The medical combine portion is going to happen this weekend. So now we're 3 weeks away from the draft. No team really has all the medical information that they need or that they want. So only half the prospects are actually going to make it to Indianapolis this weekend. The other half just had telehealth visits. The other limitation is that teams can only bring 2 medical staff with them. So you're not going to see as many specialists. When you evaluated a guy like Tua last year, you wanted to make sure you had a hip specialist or a traumatologist. Well, teams simply aren't going to be able to do that this year. It's probably going to be the head athletic trainer and the orthopedic doctor. It's purely orthopedic focused, and obviously there won't be time for rechecks, even if something is, picked up this weekend. So the way teams grade or team docs grade athletes, it depends on the team, right? The Rams, I think, use like an A through E scale. The Patriots use a 1 through 5. But basically the grades fall into a bell curve like I drew here, where you have just a few guys that have really a pristine injury history with just like some soft tissue problems, like a sprain, strain, nothing that's really been recurrent and nothing that's worrisome in the future. So basically A's are all punters and kickers. Most guys are going to fall into the B and C category. So a B is something like recurrent hamstring strains, recurrent ankle sprains, maybe like a joint sprain that was sort of non-significant, but something that's not worrisome for sort of long-term consequences. C's are going to be athletes who have like an ACL tear, which we know could lead to arthritis down the road, but nothing imminent. Or like a shoulder instability, but these athletes all had a really good exam at the combine, and teams feel pretty confident in them. The D athletes are the ones who have had multiple ligament reconstructions, like a knee that's had multiple ligaments reconstructed, or a joint that's been repaired but is still pretty unstable. And these athletes, the team is a little bit more concerned that there could be an issue even in the short term, in the next few years. And then a handful of athletes are failed every year. And that could be just for a medical problem, like a cancer that was picked up, thankfully, or a heart condition that's incompatible with playing in the NFL until it's addressed. But then some teams just look at an athlete, they look at their injury history and they say, you know what, we love this guy, he's amazing, but we're not going to touch him because we're just too worried. So that athlete would get failed. So the first athlete I want to talk about is Caleb Farley, just because he was, his injury or his surgery news was the most recent. So he sort of had a rough start to college. He tore his ACL in a non-contact injury the first day of practice his freshman year, came back a season later and was converted from wide receiver to cornerback. And he had a great season. After that season, unfortunately, over the summer, he was training, did a deadlift, and herniated the bottom two discs in his back, L4-5 and L5-S1. He pushed through the season, but he missed the last two games with back spasms. And, as a doctor who watches football, whenever I hear that, it's always something concerning because it's oftentimes a sign of something going on deeper in the spine. So sure enough, in the off season, he actually had a microdiscectomy surgery on only one of the discs, and he got some relief. Then he opted out of the COVID season last year. And concerningly, after a year away from football, had a flare up of his symptoms in February and ended up with microdiscectomy surgery on the other disc that was not addressed surgically last month. So no one's seen him play football since 2019, which is obviously, something to think about. He obviously was unable to do his pro day workout.
How would you advise a team? Like, what kind of risk are we taking to take him in the first round?
So I think a lot of that's going to depend on his imaging and his exam. It's hard to say. It depends on position. I think, he's probably better off than a lineman who, is going to stress that spine a little bit more. A bigger guy is going to put a little bit more stress, but it's definitely something worrisome. I mean, this is a guy who's had 2 surgeries and he's not even out of college yet. So I definitely think this is going to affect him. And I would definitely tell a team, look, we've really got to do a deep dive into this guy at the combine. And, I'm going to make a comparison on the next slide to Rob Gronkowski and how he was graded by teams, because I think there are some parallels to be drawn. And we can talk about how he's a little bit of a different situation. In some ways, maybe better. But first, I just wanted to give you because all of you guys probably hear spine and you're like, oh, that's really bad. But I think it's important just to have the tiniest little bit of knowledge of what it means so that you can understand why we're so concerned in the long run. So, this image on the right side is a spine from the side. It's an MRI. And these squares are the vertebral bodies. Those are the bones that are stacked on each other. That makes up the spine, and they're separated by these little jelly donut discs. And I say jelly donut because they're like donuts. They have a little white jelly center and a black outer rim. And you can see the spinal cord kind of ends up here, but these are the little spinal nerves coming down. So this is L4-5, this is L5-S1. Almost always those are the discs that are a problem. And we can see this one, L4-5, looks all right. It's still got a little bit of white jelly. It's bulging a little bit, but overall it looks fine. This lower one, there's no white jelly left. It's all herniated back. And you can see, this is bulging. It's rubbing up against this nerve. So athletes like this undergo microdiscectomy surgery. This is an athlete laying on their stomach. They made a tiny incision, stuck in this little tiny vacuum, sucked out some of that jelly, patched things up. So essentially taking off this big bulge right here. And the athlete can return to play in 3 months. So most people will be like, well, that doesn't seem like a really big deal. But the problem is that in athletes, we know that once they have a spine problem, it doesn't just go away. They end up having another flare up a few years later. And so, when this news broke of his surgery, I remember Albert Breer called me and he was like, what do you think? What do you think of this? What does this mean? And immediately we just started talking about it in terms of Rob Gronkowski. So just the quick review going into the 2010 draft, a year before he declared, Gronk, he herniated L5-S1, also deadlifting in the off season. So you can make that parallel. He tried to avoid surgery, still ended up having surgery that season. So obviously all eyes were on that because he was definitely the most talented and athletic tight end in that class. So when it came to the combine, everyone wanted to, see what does his spine look like? And I know for a fact at least 6 or 7 teams failed him on his medicals and said, you know what, we love him, he's a great player, but that spine looks like garbage, and I don't think you should touch him no matter how much you like him. The Patriots, on the other hand, gave him a 3 discuss grade. And 3 discussed, it's kind of like a C-. And that means that he had a significant injury. It could cause a problem even in the shorter long term. And it's a guy they wanted to bring back 2 weeks before the draft. So he went back for a recheck. The Patriots did a real deep dive. Most of it, I mean, they did a close exam, but most of it was like asking him questions. So getting to know him, where's his head out? What's his recovery like? Are you in the weight room? Are you squatting? How much are you squatting? How often are you squatting? How do you feel afterwards? What do you do? How much are you in the training room? What are you doing to recover? So once they got through all those questions, they felt a little bit better about him. So they felt so good that they moved up 2 spots, they traded up. And the funny thing is that they actually frog leaped the Ravens, who, from what I understand, probably wouldn't have touched him anyway because of his medicals. So you can see that even just one injury, one guy, you ask this question, what would you advise a team? You're going to get different answers depending on the team doctor you have. And you can understand why, because Rob has had a great career, but he's missed a lot of playing time. I mean, he's had 2 spine surgeries since then. So it's something to consider when you're looking at spine injuries. Does anyone have any comments, questions on that?
I mean, like, just out of curiosity, like Gronkowski would be like a best case scenario, right? Because as you said, he's missed some time, but he's still playing. And I mean, like, how realistic is someone to be on that same sort of ability to withstand it, having had this, like Gronk?
I think it's a great question. Again, I don't think we have a crystal ball. I wish. So there's not like black and white data where we've like looked at guys like this and I can tell you for sure what their likelihood of being like Gronk is. But again, the player position comes into it, how much they're stressing the spine. I would expect that Caleb's going to have more spine problems down the road. It's just how long is that going to take? And again, what's his recovery going to be like? So it's a risk. This is a high stakes risk game that doctors in general do not like to play. We're not big gamblers, which hopefully you all can appreciate.
With a back, doc, I've always heard you can repair a back injury unlike you fix a broken arm. Is that fair?
Yes. And actually, you just reminded me of an important point that I didn't make. When we looked at this MRI, this lower disc, there's already arthritis forming here. And so you can fix the spine, but you can't fix the spine and let the athlete play. So ultimately, an athlete like this, after you've done a couple of these discectomies and removed some of this disc, there comes a point where there's nothing else to remove. And then you talk about a fusion. And that's when you're like taking multiple levels of bone and attaching them together. And those guys really can't play the game of football afterwards. So now on to another red flag injury. Jalen Phillips obviously has had many concussions in his career. His first concussion was at the age of 10. He's had many since. He actually retired from football after he had 3, 4, it's unclear, concussions in one season at UCLA. He went to community college, kind of got himself physically better, felt mentally more prepared, went back to football, played for Miami, and obviously has been very productive. I mean, if you look at his pro day numbers, I put them up there. They're impressive. I mean, he's an athletic specimen. The problem with concussions, as I think we all kind of understand, is that the more concussions you have, the more likely you are to have more concussions. And the more concussions you have, the longer the recovery after each. And at some point, they can just start to blend together where the athlete's got headaches all the time and just unable to be productive. And the other thing is we just don't know how many concussions is too many, right? The cutoff could be different for every athlete. When these athletes come into the combine, it's not like there's a test we can do, like an MRI, and we can look at it and say, oh my gosh, look at all that degenerative change. Like there's so much arthritis like we can with the knee. With a concussion, an MRI is not going to tell us anything. It's really all about talking to the athlete. So for him, it's going to be important to find out where his head's at, where his heart's at. He's already retired once. Is this something he's really committed to? Does he understand his risk? Does he feel comfortable with that risk? What's he doing to try to mitigate that risk? Really getting to the heart of it. And so when you see a quote like, I'm going to go until the wheels come off, like that could be a great thing or not such a great thing when you're talking to an athlete. So I think this is the part where he's going to have to really shine and convince teams. Obviously, he's convinced them on the field that, you know, and everyone's going to want to take him, but they also have to look at this part because he may not be able to stay on the field very much.
Dr. Flynn, let me ask you this, because this is something that a lot of people on the call have dealt with. We're in a obviously very competitive environment. This is a really good pass rusher. But for the concussions, it's a very clean background. And you're going to sit there and say, you know, there's risk and you should wait a couple of rounds because of the risk. And then our response is going to be, well, you know, somebody could take him in the first round. And how do you like just try to normalize those discussions where, like, what's a reasonable sort of position in with your expertise, like if you were advising a team, like trying to make that reasoned, balanced decision between, you know, outstanding ability but not being reckless in terms of like how big of a risk is it? And, you know, at least for me, I would say like having predictable orthopedic injuries, you know, that was a comforting thought. You know, anytime you hear that from the doctors, what's scary about concussions, in my opinion, is like just, you know, the uncertainty of it. So how, if you were advising the coaches and, you know, front office people on this call, you know, how would you give them counsel on where you would feel comfortable pulling the trigger?
Well, I think that's a great point and a great question. It's so variable, right? And so I think I would want this information. I would want to know, what did the guy sound like? You know, emotionally, where is he? Because the reality is with a guy like this, he could have 2 completely clean seasons and then suddenly get into a problem. I think we saw that, you know, Rex Burkhead he was out for a season with neck problems. Okay. We all know what was really going on. So you have seen athletes who have lost substantial time with this. And the reassuring thing is that he actually did pretty well last season. But I think what really matters again is how he performs, how he talks about it, because he could have 2 concussions and just quit. You don't know.
Dr. Flynn, it's Joe Banner. I have a slight variation on the same question. Man, our toughest decisions came with guys that had had a lot of smaller injuries, and trying to figure out if that meant they were, you know, this injury prone label, or these were just aberrations. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be a guy that's going to miss 2 or 3 or 4 games every year, or constantly be pulling his hamstring. He's never had the big concussion, never tore his ACL, but he keeps having something. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you figure out how to, you know, line that person up, or is there any clear answer on, you know, how to define the risk there and when it makes sense and when it doesn't?
Looking at what the injury types are, like, were they freak things? Did he just forget to tuck his shoulder? You know, did he take a step back in bounds? You guys can guess who I'm talking about there. But like, or is it the hamstrings always? And looking at training, again, finding out how much time they're spending in the training room, seeing what they're doing in the off season, and then maybe thinking of changing some of that stuff up. That's a really good conversation for the head trainer to have, to find out. So it's can you draw like a parallel and say like, or like connect all of those injuries together? Is there something that can be changed? But, you know, I would hope that those athletes would be less likely to lose time once they're in the NFL. I just, you know, I think their training will be a little bit higher quality and close, even more closely monitored. But, you know, I think it's a good point. Landon Dickerson, obviously a very talented center. He has a common injury, bilateral ACL tears. Most recently tore his left ACL in December. 2 weeks later, you know, took a snap in the national championship game, showed great character. You know, his recovery, no matter what he shows on Instagram, no matter how many cartwheels he's doing at pro days, it's going to be 8 to 12 months. So he's someone who may be coming back just at the start of his first season in the NFL. So I just want to make that point, that it's really, really important to let these guys fully heal, because otherwise the re-rupture rate is huge. And speaking of huge, I specifically picked this picture of him because I wanted you to see If you showed me this picture a couple of years ago, I would tell you he's knock-kneed. You can see that he's kind of knock-kneed, and that means that he's at risk of tearing both ACLs. So I would have worried about that, and I would have worried about earlier onset knee arthritis. And arthritis is just, it happens almost in every knee that has an ACL tear. At the combine, athletes going to the combine with a history of an ACL tear, which often is accompanied by a meniscus tear, the arthritis rate is 50%. So when they when they get to the combine and have their imaging, 50% of them already have arthritis. So I think it's something to just be aware of. Also, the heavier athletes, the BMI over 30, so the big boys, have a higher rate of arthritis earlier on. So it's not a deal breaker. I don't think that the ACL tears specifically are going to hold him back, but I just want you to know why we worry about ACL tears, and especially why we would worry about multiple ACL tears in one knee. Finally, the splashy player, Jaylen Waddle. Love watching him play. Super fast, super dynamic. It was heartbreaking to see him injure his ankle in late October. He was just returning the kickoff and got tackled, and his foot got stuck weird in the turf, and he sustained what looked like a fractured dislocation of his ankle. Generally, that takes about 6 months to heal after surgery. It requires surgery to stabilize it. And this is what it looks like. All the high ankle ligaments are torn. So the joint is just totally unstable. So this construct with the screws and stuff is what's needed. Athletes, believe it or not, as long as when they scope them, they don't have any major damage in here to the ankle joint, and to do very well with this injury. You know, Marcus Mariota had it, Derek Carr had it, both on the same day, actually. This is like the Dak Prescott injury, although his was open, so that's a much more serious injury. But I expect that as long as the cartilage look good, and that's something they're going to look at the combine, that he should do very well. And it shouldn't, I really think he's a lock for going on the first day.